Movie Night by Chris Trotter. It was night time. The lights of the great metropolis had been twinkling like stars for several hours. Traffic on the boulevard had been as constant as ever. From a distance it looked like hundreds of fireflies on a conveyor belt. The air was humid. It had been that way for a week, both day and night. It was unrelenting. Crime had risen as a result of the heat, as people's tempers flared. The police were having to deal with increased instances of road rage. There were more cases of domestic violence. The city was reaching boiling point. The angel sat watching the city from the rooftop of a 20-story building. She had observed it from many different viewpoints over the years, but always it was the same thing she saw: strife, poverty, loneliness and fear. But mingled in between all that pain was love, nestling into the cracks of society, slowly healing them. Her attention was drawn suddenly to a man coming out of a bar. His energies were melancholy. It was 9 o'clock on a Friday night. Jimmy Alonso had finished work at 6 and had immediately walked into the nearest bar. He now emerged onto the warm street and tried to figure out what he was going to do next. Across the road, the flashing neon lights of an adult video store caught his eye. He sauntered in that direction. Alonso was in his early 30s and single. He worked as a car mechanic for a company that paid him a pittance and wouldn't increase his wages. He hated his life, finding no meaning in it whatsoever. He existed from day to day on a diet of porno, pizza and booze, and his body had paid the price. He entered the adult store, letting the door close behind him with a tinkle. It sounded louder than it was, for there was no one else in the store except for the retailer, who sat behind the counter reading a book, from which he never looked up. Alonso pulled his cap down a little further, as if he didn't want to be recognized, as he perused the contents of the hardcore shelf. After 10 minutes he chose one and took it to the counter. The retailer looked up at him, then grudgingly set the book aside and scanned the item into the till. He did this without a word. "Can I have a bag for that?" asked Alonso. "We've run out," replied the retailer. Alonso looked down at himself. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Then he noticed a bag on the floor by the retailer's foot. "There's one there," said Alonso. "That's mine." Alonso handed over the cash. "Thanks for your help," he said. "You're welcome." He walked out of the store, clutching the video by his side. The angel's eyes strayed from Alonso for a moment and came to rest on a young woman who was sitting in her car in a side alley. She was crying. Becky Withers' day had gone from bad to worse. It had started when she'd been told she hadn't got the job she had applied for 2 weeks ago. She'd been so hopeful about getting it, but they had said it was between her and someone else who turned out to have more experience. She'd gone back to bed after the phone call and had slept until lunchtime. When she woke, she had a pounding headache. She went to the store to buy aspirin, where she'd met her boyfriend. They went for lunch at her favourite diner, and she poured out her feelings to him while he munched his way through a plate of egg and chips. They had agreed to meet up later that evening to go to a concert. But on her way there, she happened to see him entering a nightclub, holding hands with another woman. She had pulled the car to a stop and confronted him, at which point she was told it was over. He wasn't interested anymore. On driving home in a furious rage, her car had broken down in the alley. Now she had broken down. She sat sobbing her heart out in the glare of a fluorescent street light. Alonso's first thought was to go straight home and stick in the video, but on a sudden impulse he decided that going to the cinema would be a better choice. He now turned into the alleyway which would take him towards the North Street, where the picture house was situated. He saw Becky sitting there, and as he approached he slowed his pace. Miss, are you okay?" "Do I look okay?" she snapped. Alonso lowered his head and carried on walking. "Wait," she shouted. He turned back to her. She stared at him for a moment, and then said pathetically, "Do you have a phone on you? My car's broken down." "I don't, but I am a mechanic. I could take a look if you want." She nodded. He put the video on the ground and opened the bonnet. He began examining the engine. She got out and came round to look. "What do you think's wrong with it?" she asked, trying to wipe away her smeared mascara. "Can't say at that moment." Becky suddenly noticed the title of the video. "Movie night tonight, is it?" Alonzo froze. Yeah," he said, slowly turning round. She smiled and nodded. "You live on your own?" "Is it that obvious?" asked Alonzo. Becky shrugged. Alonzo straightened up. "I don't have much luck with women," he said sheepishly. Then he turned back to the engine. "I don't seem to have too much luck with men myself. My boyfriend just dumped me tonight." The tears started to come back. "Oh, I'm sorry. That sucks. My girlfriend dumped me a year ago. I still feel a little bruised." He fiddled awkwardly with his ear. "But you'll figure out a way to keep going. I went to the gym a lot. I even took a course in first aid because I thought it might be in handy one day. At my workplace. Kind of a dangerous environment, garages. What else did I do?" "Watched porn," she said, smiling. "Yeah, it's always a good distraction technique." The two of them stood there for a moment in silence. "I better see to your car," said Alonzo. In the end, there was nothing he could do without his tools, so he went to a payphone to call for a pickup. As the car was being towed away, Alonzo said, I was actually on my way to the picture house on North Street. You want to come and see a movie with me?" She smiled. "Yeah, why not?" They started to walk in that direction. "So what do you do yourself?" asked Alonzo. "Nothing," she said sadly. "I study flower arranging at college, and I recently applied for a job at a wedding planner's, but I didn't get it." The angel listened as they talked, and observed with satisfaction how their energies merged as they strolled along the pavement. They strolled past a man in a parked car. He sat in the driver's seat, sweat dripping from his face. He was shaking all over. His eyes were wide, and his heart was palpitating. His name was Elliot Codell, and he was going through withdrawal symptoms. He was a heroin addict with no money and no fix. He needed cash fast. He put his head in his hands and squeezed his eyes shut. He thought about his life. His childhood had not been without its difficulties. A broken home, an alcoholic father who beat him, a stint in a young offenders' prison, etc. It was hardly any surprise that his life had continued to go down that hill from then on. He had worked in a warehouse, stacking and labelling boxes all day, until he had been fired for poor performance. Now he was jobless and penniless. He had signed up for benefit, but the money was not enough to feed both his body and his habit. Codell didn't believe in God, but for a few weeks now he had walked past churches and stopped, actually contemplating the possibility of going inside. He had no faith, and therefore he had no right to enter a church. Churches were for good people, not losers like him. But he knew that all it would take was a sign from whatever these church-going people were so adamant existed. In a sudden desperate moment of mental pain, he said something that might have been construed as a prayer. "Somebody help me," he said, beginning to rock himself backwards and forwards. "Somebody get me out of this mess." He didn't see the angel, who had left her lofty perch and was now sitting in the back seat of the car. She touched him on the top of his head, triggering a thought in his mind about a film he had once seen. Suddenly he looked up. The picture house signs were flashing. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the switchblade. The angel now moved on to a cafe where Officer Lewis was buying a soda to take out. Next to him, at the counter, stood a young man in a red shirt and black trousers. He seemed in a hurry to pick up a pre-ordered sandwich. Officer Lewis was thinking about his 12-year-old son, Michael. Michael was less than impressed with his dad, who just wasn't cool enough. He was a police officer, and police officers were meant to be tough and chase after bad guys with guns and wrestle them to the floor. Officer Lewis had never had the opportunity to be the hero cop that Michael wanted him to be. It was made even worse by the fact that Lewis was in the process of a divorce from his wife Karen, and Michael thought it was his father that was at fault. He was slowly losing both of them, and if the custody hearing went Katie's way, he would. The man next to him grabbed the sandwich and made a bolt for the door after looking at his watch. As he ran, something fell from his pocket onto the floor. Officer Lewis noticed this and retrieved the fallen item, which was an identity badge. The young man was an employee at the picture house. Lewis collected his drink and walked out of the cafe. He would take the badge along to the cinema and then continue his patrol of the area. Becky and Alonzo entered the picture house and joined the queue for tickets. "What do you want to see?" asked Becky. "There's a new action thriller out with, I forget the guy's name. I'm not really into action flicks." "Are there any comedies on?" "I don't know." The woman in front then turned her head. "There's a few," she said, smiling. "That's what I'm here for. I need a laugh at the moment." Becky smiled. "Same. People need pleasant things in their life. The world is depressing enough as it is. I own a flower company." Becky's eyes widened. "Really? That's so awesome. I study flower arranging." "No kidding," replied the woman. "Shirley Metcalf." She stuck out a hand and Becky shook it warmly. "I think it's always good to have flowers looking their best," said Shirley, "like actors up on the screen." "I agree," replied Becky enthusiastically. The door opened behind them and Codell entered. He stood there with his hands in his trouser pockets and weighing up his options. He fingered the handle of the switchblade. 2 minutes earlier, Officer Lewis had entered the security room where the young man with the sandwich worked. "You dropped your identity badge, Kevin," said Lewis. "Thanks," replied Kevin. "How's everything going in here?" "Pretty smooth for a Friday night," said Kevin. He looked at the security monitors that covered the foyer. "Things are looking—" He stopped. He was staring at screen 1, which covered the front desk. "What's wrong?" asked Lewis. "Take a look for yourself," replied Kevin. Codell had one arm wrapped around Becky's neck, and with his right hand he held the switchblade to her throat. "I'm not going to tell you again," he shouted to the staff. "Take the cash out of the register and put it in a bag." Everybody in the foyer had frozen, all looking at Codell. Alonzo had been forced to step back away from Becky. Her eyes were wide with terror, and for the second time that night she was crying. "Jimmy," she was saying. "It's all right, I'm here." "Shut up!" yelled Codell. The staff were still standing there. They had done nothing. "I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2... "Put the knife down and get on the floor," shouted Lewis. Codell spun round, still holding Becky. He saw the officer's gun pointed directly at him. He pressed the blade closer against her skin. "I said drop it," shouted Lewis again. There was a moment's pause, but it seemed like a lifetime. And in that lifetime of a pause, the angel observed her work, looking from one person to another, one actor to another. The lights were there, the cameras were rolling, and now it was time for action. Lewis pulled the trigger on his gun, but it jammed. Alonzo lunged forward and made a grab at the knife hand, but in so doing the blade slipped, slicing into Becky's throat. Lewis pulled his trigger again, and this time the gun went off, the bullet hitting Codell in the shoulder. And as he fell, something happened. He saw, standing between Becky and Alonzo, a brilliant white form. It looked like a woman, thought Codell, and yet she had wings similar to that of a dove. He didn't feel the pain as he crashed onto the floor. Neither did he hear anything but his own thoughts. "Wow," they said. "Look at that beautiful angel." Alonzo rushed forward. Blood poured out of the wound in Becky's throat. Without hesitation he pulled off his t-shirt and used it to stem the flow, pressing it hard against the cut. Officer Lewis was busy securing Codell, and everyone around them was panicking. Becky was now unconscious. Alonzo tied the shirt in place and put his ear to her mouth. He could barely feel any breath. He tilted her head back, trying to keep her airways clear, and then she stopped breathing altogether. Alonzo clamped his lips over hers and gave her 2 breaths. Then he began vigorous CPR on her chest. The angel sat peacefully on the floor in the middle of all this commotion and smiled. Officer Lewis had handcuffed Codell and made a call on his radio for assistance. The flower lady now came to Alonzo's side and held Becky's hand. Alonzo continued to work on her for another 3 minutes. It wasn't looking good. But suddenly she opened her eyes and began to cough. 2 ambulances arrived shortly after. The first medic team put Becky on a stretcher. As they carried her outside, she took Alonzo's hand. "You saved my life," she whispered. "I know," he replied, smiling. "Will you come with me to the hospital?" she croaked. "Sure," said Alonzo. Officer Lewis was reading Codell his rights when his colleagues turned up. Codell was being attended to by the second team of medics. He lay there, a serene smile on his face. "What are you smiling about?" asked Lewis incredulously. "I asked for a sign," he said, "and I got one." Lewis turned away. As he turned, he saw two people standing, watching him. Karen stood next to Michael, her arm around his shoulder. She had tears in her eyes. "Hi," was all Lewis could say. Michael broke away from his mother and ran towards him. Karen slowly followed. "I saw," she said quietly. "Lucky I was here," said Lewis. Michael was still hugging him. "You're a hero," he said. "Yeah, I am," replied Lewis, not taking his eyes off Karen. It was Karen who looked away first. There was a hint of guilt in the gesture. The angel turned away now, too. She left the picture house behind and moved down the street. As she went, her right wing touched a couple who were arguing on the sidewalk. They had once embraced and made up. The angel drifted back to her perch on top of the building and resumed her watch. Who'd be next, she thought.